All right. I think we are live. Shout out to everybody who's watching live. I'm sure we're about to get a few more people come through. Hope you all are doing well. This is Phil's Guide to psyd. If you're in the chat, put just a comment down if you can hear me okay. So, as we've done before in the past, this is pretty much a time where I will answer any questions that you all might have. But I also will go through my phone just because of questions that I've been going through on social media that I can answer here as well. I think the last time that we did a live stream was a couple months ago. So it's been a minute, but I'm super excited to be here. I know there's a lot of people who are getting ready for applications. So we have a few people who are trying to get into graduate school who are looking to apply to clinical psychology programs. And so you might have some questions about personal statement, the GRE, in terms of what schools to choose, how to interview well. And so we'll talk about all of that today, and we'll get into anything else that you guys want to go through. So super excited to go through it. And before we start, and as you're coming in, please put your questions in the comment section below. And then that way I can see that, and we can kind of go from there. So crazy to think about 4 years ago, I was going through this application process and super stressful, especially when it came to making sure that you're meeting the deadlines, that you are ready for the interview section, that your materials are ready to go. I think if I can offer any bit of advice for anyone that's going through that process is really just to take your time, take it slow, take it one step at a time. It truly is a marathon. And so I know there's some schools, there's some programs that have the deadline anywhere from November and December, and then interviews typically happen in January and February. So you're looking at anywhere from a 4 to 5 month span where you're just in it. You're just kind of on, you're getting ready for it. And so really take that time for self-care, take that time to really make sure that you're taking care of yourself, your physical health, your mental health, and all of those different things. I think that's really, really important. So to start out with, one of the questions that I've been getting a lot is how to pick certain clinical psychology graduate schools. How to even go about picking those schools in general. And honestly, if I had to really pick like what the most important thing about this whole process is the question of fit. Because if you pick the right schools to apply to, you increase your chances of getting accepted uh, very like astronomically. All right, so it's a really big deal in terms of picking the right school. One of the things that you can always do in terms of trying to find out what school you want to apply to is really just understanding your own passions, your own desires. If you like working with underserved populations, if your mission is to work internationally, if you want to work in a certain setting like a hospital or school, you want to make sure that your own mission, your own personal passions align with that school's mission. So that's really important. One of the ways that you can go into that is that you can look at the faculties of the specific schools, and you can look at their publications. You can look at maybe if they've written any books or if they're doing certain research that aligns with your passions. That's really important because if you can pick the right school that has your right passions, then you can tailor a personal statement. You can get letters of recommendations from people who know that environment. And then you can also, when you go into the interviews, you can talk about the same passions that you have that some of those other faculty members have as well. So that becomes really, really crucial is picking the right schools to apply to. And then from there, once you've picked the right school, you can align your whole application materials with that decision. Another question that I typically get a lot is when you are trying to figure out whether or not, so let's say you've chosen 5 to 6 schools that you think really meshes well with your fit, in terms of your goals, in terms of your short-term plans and your long-term plans. So let's say you've picked 5 to 6 schools. The question is, your personal statement, all right? So a lot of questions, sometimes schools will have specific prompts in terms of the personal statement, and like you just have to answer that prompt, but sometimes they leave it open. And when they leave it open, I think this is a valuable time that you can really write about who you are. The thing is that they already see your application materials, they're going to interview you, and so you want to write about something that isn't in your application materials. And this could be like getting really vulnerable about different things that you've gone through. You don't have to necessarily share details, but I think it's really important to share about your some of the weaknesses, some of the things that you've gone through, whether it was in school, whether it was in family life, and tell the story, tell a coherent story about why you are choosing clinical psychology. And as you talk about your struggles, as you talk about the ups and downs, you can put in little bits and pieces of, I got some clinical experience here, I got some research experience there. So you can still tie in some of your application materials, but it's really important to tell the story of who you are. So I'm looking at the comment section. Looks like we have our first question. So the first question is, I am a first year psychology student from South Africa. So I want to know, which schools would you recommend for neuropsychology, and is it a great choice? Wonderful, wonderful question. Thank you for coming through from South Africa. I wonder what time it is over there. So, to answer your question, I think the way that kind of what I've already been talking about is, if you are international or even if you're here in the States, I always tend to emphasize APA accreditation. So, part of the reason of why that is that going to an APA accredited school, it just makes your life a lot easier when you are looking to apply for internship, for postdoc, and for getting jobs. There are some jobs, some places that will not take students that have gone to an APA accredited school. So it's really, really important to think about that process. Now, it's still possible to become a psychologist even without an APA accredited program, or even without an APA accredited internship, but your options are going to be limited. So if you're looking for clinical psychology programs in the States, I would look specifically for APA accreditation. And then I would look for programs, whether PhD or PsyD, that have a neuropsych focus. And so they're clinical psychology programs, PhD and PsyD. But let's say you go into their website and they have neuropsychology classes that you can take, like intro to neuropsychology or intro to some type of brain neurology class. That's a really good sign. And then I would also email the school and ask them if they have opportunities for students to go into neuropsychology practicum sites. This is really, really important, right? Because it's not just enough that the school gives you neuropsychology classes. You also want to make sure that you get neuropsychology experiences in your practicum settings. So that's the second thing. The third thing is that you want to make sure that the faculty members have neuropsychology experience. So that means that they should have neuropsychology publications. They should be board certified in neuropsychology if that's an option for them. They should have perhaps even a neuropsychology lab. So that's a really good sign as well, because that way you're going into a neuropsych focus, you have neuropsych practicum experience, and you're in a neuropsychology lab that you can tailor your dissertation around neuropsychology, so that once you finish your program and you apply to neuropsychology programs, you have the school to back you up, you have the clinical experience, and you have the research experience to give you the biggest competitive edge to get into those neuropsychology internships and therefore the postdocs. So those are the three things that I would look for in terms of if you're looking for programs, whether it's APA accreditation, a neuropsychology lab, neuropsychology courses, or faculty members that are neuropsychology board certified and have a lab or some research that you can do as well. All right. So hopefully that can answer your question, but that's a fantastic question. And that leads into kind of what I was talking about earlier in terms of if you're trying to find the right school to apply to, make sure that it aligns with your passions, make sure the accreditation is there, make sure that the research experience is there. Even if you're applying to PsyD programs, research experience is still important. It's only going to make you more competitive when you apply to internship and postdoc. And so, even if there's a PsyD program that doesn't necessarily focus on research, it's just still going to look good on your application. And yeah, no problem at all. Once again, feel free, spit out those questions if you have them. If not, I'll kind of keep going through what's next in terms of the application process. Okay, I see we have another question. In your opinion, what would you say is the most important part of an application for a PhD in counseling psychology? Fantastic question. Yes. No, this is such a good question. So, in terms of my personal opinion, what is the most important part of that application? I think it just really depends on the school. Unfortunately, it's hard to give you a direct answer because there are some schools that really do care about your GRE scores and your GPA. If your GRE and your GPA is good, they're going to bring you right on in, right? And then there's some schools that are going to look at your clinical experience and your research experience, and those two things are going to be really, really important. If your personal statement's not that great, or if you don't have really that great of letter of recommendation letters, that's it's whatever. But they might really focus on that research experience and that clinical experience because they themselves are passionate about those two things. So when you're applying for different schools, if you can just go through their website and see what they keep telling you, see the messages that they keep saying, how are they talking about their program? Depending on how they talk about their program, you can figure out what they're focused on and what they're emphasizing. And you can kind of figure out what you should also emphasize as well before you apply to that program. I think from a personal perspective, I think the thing that seems to help a lot of students is having good enough clinical experience and good enough research experience. I'll talk about clinical experience. Clinical experience can look like a lot of different things. Sometimes people think, oh, well, that means I have to be a master's level therapist, or, I have to be like a psychology aide, or I have to work with some type of mental health professional. Not necessarily. Clinical experience could look like working for a suicide hotline. It could look like working for some type of social work setting where you're doing case management work. It could look like maybe you are in a setting where you are the front desk to some type of community health center. It could look like behavioral therapy, where you're working with kids that have autism. It could look like so much if you're in a healthcare setting and you're a nurse assistant or a medical assistant, or you're a clinical informatics specialist and you do some of the coding and some of the progress notes for doctors and nurse practitioners. Like for me, the clinical experience that I had was purely medical because I was coming from a medical perspective, but I was able to talk about my medical perspective from a clinical perspective because I was interacting with patients on a daily level. And so that counts as clinical experience, whether it's in the medical field, the social health field, the social work field, anything that deals with basically you interacting with people on a consistent basis and deals with kind of helping people, whether it's individuals or communities. And so that's really important. I think that's probably the most important thing I would say, whether you're applying to clinical psychology programs or counseling psychology programs, is that they want to see that you have a good amount of experience from a clinical perspective, because that means that you can do the work, you can do the therapy, you can do all of those different things, and you're probably going to be really successful. The other things, maybe after the clinical experience, might be some research experience, although that's not super important for a lot of programs. And then maybe after that, they want to see that you have a decent GRE or GAP score, or right after that, maybe it's the personal statement and the letter of recommendation letters. Those would probably be at the bottom, the letter of recommendation and the personal statement. And then it would probably be the GRE and the GPA. And then it would be your clinical experience probably at the top, depending on what program you apply to. If you are applying to a program that has a lot of faculty members who have 30 plus publications, they're just publication after publication after publication, that means that they probably care a lot about research. And so you probably are going to want to prioritize an application that showcases your research experience, right? And so whatever the program is emphasizing on their website, or from what you gather when you ask them questions through email or calling, you want to emphasize the same things for your application, right? So if there is a lab that you're really interested in and it looks like that faculty member has 80 to 100 different publications, it's probably a good idea that you can put in your application that you've had some type of research experience, whether it's a poster presentation, whether it's a publication, whether it's working for a lab in your undergraduate program, whatever it is. It's really important to emphasize that if they are emphasizing that. Typically, clinical psychology PhD programs are always going to emphasize research. The PsyD programs are hit or miss, where there's some PsyD programs that love research and care about research, and then there's some that don't care about it as much. And typically, your dissertation is more like a thesis. But then with counseling psychology programs too, there's a variance in terms of how much they care about research and how much they don't. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. I would say if all else, focus on the clinical experience, try and get that up, try and showcase your skills in different settings that you have had to apply some form of clinical experience. And I think that will bring your application a long ways ahead. So wonderful, wonderful question. So if we're going through that kind of concept of picking a school, and from picking a school, figuring out your personal statement, telling a coherent story about who you are. One thing that I always tell students is, in every bit of your application process, you want to make sure that there's a little piece of you in all of the application materials. So what that means is that for the personal statement, don't be afraid to share vulnerably about a piece of you that they would not be able to know from your CV or your resume, right? CV or resume is a very professional format, but your personal statement, you can talk to the emotion, you can speak to the emotional connection of the people that are going to be looking at your application. So that's important. From your personal statement, then you have your CV. And with the CV, right, that is also telling the committee a story of your clinical experiences, your research experiences, your professional experiences, your volunteer, different organizations that you've been a part of, your education, all of those different things. On my website, I have a format that you can use that kind of has just like a template for going through your CV. So you can check that out. I'll leave it down in the link description below. But even in the CV, you can tell a story, and the story that you want to tell should be coherent with the story that you're telling in your personal statement. So what that means is that if in your personal statement you've talked about different things of like working for certain organizations, or you volunteered for something, and you found out that that volunteer experience was something that was made you passionate about clinical psychology, then in your CV you also want to kind of tell that coherent story and showcase that you're really passionate about volunteering, you're really passionate about certain organizations that you're a part of, and tell that in kind of that coherent storyline. Once you go from your CV, you're probably going to look a little bit into finding people to essentially write your letter of recommendation. And here's the thing with that. There's a lot of ways that you can go about this, because you can go as strategic as you want when it comes to finding someone to write you a letter or a letter of recommendation. I always recommend that it's important to find doctors, people who perhaps are psychologists themselves. The benefit of this is that obviously, if you're applying to a clinical psychology program and you have a letter writer who's a psychologist, that's going to look really, really well. But even if you don't have a psychologist who's writing a letter for you, any form of a doctor will probably do, typically because they can speak to your professional and clinical skills. And so a lot of my letter writers were my professors who had doctorates in psychology, social health. One was a chemist and a physicist. So, even though they weren't directly correlating with clinical psychology, they still were able to speak to my education experiences, the courses that I took with them, getting good grades with them, my professionalism, my organizational skills. All of those things are really, really important. And so some schools will have 2 to 3 letter writers that they might want you to choose from. And again, I would choose wisely. I would even, when you email or ask your letter writers to write your letter of recommendation, ask them if they can write you a strong letter of recommendation. And meaning that, it's they you don't want them to just pull up a template and then put your name at the top and say that you're a decent student. You want them to try and personalize it as much as you can. And you also want to give them as much time to write that letter. I'd say 2 to 3 months in advance. And one thing that is really helpful is that you can send them kind of a narrative or a bullet list of things that you might want them to talk about in your letter. So for example, you can talk about, like, in one page summary, you can list your education. You can pretty much summarize your CV. You can list your education, you can list what you're passionate about, you can list your awards, and you can list what other perhaps supervisors have mentioned about you. Put the quotes if you have them, and you can send it to them, right? And you can also send them, like, yeah, short term, like 5 years from now, I'm wanting to be a psychologist and working in this position in this situation with this population. So send them as much detail as you can so that they can take that information and they can personalize it into your letter, right? So that's really important as well when you're thinking about who to write you a letter and how much time to give them to write you a letter, and then also how you can help them to write the best letter possible by synthesizing and summarizing who you are as a person, what you care about, what you're passionate about, giving them a few paragraphs or a few bullet points in terms of what you're about, so that they can kind of just insert that into the letter, right? So hopefully that can be helpful as well. So, all right. So we've gone through picking a few schools. We've gone through picking a few people to write your letter. And we've talked about the CV. We talked about the personal statement. Let's see. Oh, we have a comment here. This person said, "I did this with a PowerPoint for my recommenders." Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great idea. That's fantastic. And so let's transition into what might be coming up next, which could be, let's say you get an interview. Let's say you put in your application and you get an interview, which is fantastic, which is amazing, right? And so a question that I get a lot is, how do you prepare for an interview? How do you do that? How do you go about that? And I think one way to go about preparing for interviews is really to just do a lot of mock interviews. The practice is the best. A lot of schools right now are still doing virtual interviews. There might be some programs that do in person. One thing that was really helpful for me in preparing was literally just writing a list full of questions, giving it to a friend, a family member, and then them asking me those questions. And then I just got to practice how to respond in those situations. On my website, I do have a list of questions that I actually personally received when I was interviewing, and also other people had those questions as well. And so I kind of compiled a whole number, like a worksheet of questions that you can use as well. That's also on my website, so I can put a link down below for that. But yeah, that's probably the biggest thing that's helpful for the most people, is just doing a lot of practice questions. Sometimes what you're going to run into is you're going to run into a situation where you might have to do multiple interviews with different faculty members, and it just depends on who you get, but some of them might ask you a lot of really hard questions. I know that for me, I actually got a few questions about my GPA, and I got a few questions about grades that I didn't do so well in, that I had to kind of respond. And so don't be afraid of those direct questions that they might ask about different weaknesses in your application. They just want to probably see how you respond to that, how you handled that. And for me, the best way that I was able to handle from that is that I just used it as a learning experience. And so there was a certain course that I didn't do so well in, and I admitted to that. And I just said that, it helped me to be better. It helped me to kind of study harder, study longer for different courses, and I took it as a learning a moment for myself in the future. So that's definitely something that you can do as well, is turning your weaknesses into strengths, acknowledging some of the weaknesses that might be in your application, but looking forward to the future, looking forward to what you can do and how you can grow and how you can develop. Those things are also really important as well. I was trying to remember. So I'll tell you a little bit of a story. So one of the things that can be kind of complicated is how to handle sort of the group interview setting, right? Because obviously it's not just going to be you there on that interview date. You're going to be interviewing with a host of other people as well. And it's really important to kind of, when you're in person, it's a lot easier to read the room. You can read social cues. You can, if someone's about to talk, you can wait for them to talk and then you can talk, right? But on virtual settings, it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder to read those settings. And so, one thing that I think is important is having a balanced way to kind of look at things. You still want to make a connection with other people who are interviewing in that room. That's also really important. But at the same time, you also want to assert yourself and to really make sure that you are in it, that they know that you are interested, that they know that you are part of this, that you're asking questions. And I think one of the best ways to show the committee that you're interested on a virtual platform or even in person as well is to ask really good questions. And so what I mean by that is, asking the program about the structure of their curriculum, asking them about how the process of dissertation is typically done, asking them how they prepare their students for the EPPP exam, asking about what are some of the strengths that they've seen in students when they start out in the program after their first year. What are some of the students that seem to be really successful? What are some of the traits or characteristics that they have of helping them to be successful? Those are just a few questions that you can think about asking, and whether it's asking other students who are in the program or asking the faculty members or asking anyone who's interviewing you those questions shows your interest. It shows that you're thinking about yourself in that program. But what it also does is that it helps the person that's interviewing you to kind of also picture you in that type of a situation. So what I mean by that is that when you ask some of the questions of, what do you envision a successful student to look like a year from now in your program, they might tell you some of those characteristics, but they might also be thinking about how your application matches that as well, right? So that's a little bit of a subtle way of presenting yourself in a way that shows your interest and is making them think about the future and about the possibility of you in that future, in that situation. So I think that could be really helpful as well as asking those questions. Another thing that you can do to kind of stand out in those situations is writing a thank you note. And one of the things that I did, and I don't know if this was actually really helpful, but one of the things that I did is that I brought blank thank you cards. And after I had a genuine, just authentic, good conversation with one of the faculty members, I went into a bathroom. I wrote a quick note, hey, I really appreciate us being able to talk about this. Thank you for the opportunity. And at the end of the day, I gave them that note and just a little bit of a thank you card, right? So I was in person for that. So I was able to do that. You might have some interviews that are virtual. And I think it's still good to send a thank you email, right? And again, try and make it as personalized as you can, right? So if you have an interview with someone and you guys talked about a story about how you both bonded and you both connect to the same college, you both went to the same college, or you both root for the same sports team, or whatever commonality that you shared in that space, talk about it in the email, right? Bring it up so that they can remember, oh, this is the person that I shared this laugh with, or that we shared this connection about this sports team, and oh, they just sent me a thank you letter. That's awesome, right? They're more likely to remember you. They're more likely to characterize you as someone who is thoughtful, who is intentional, and who is really kind of diligent in the way that they make an impression. So that can be really, really positive. That can really leave a positive taste after they interview you. So that's one thing that I could also recommend as well. In general, going through that interview process, it can be really, really stressful. And I think this is where you implement some of your self-care habits, whether that's doing some breathing exercises, whether that's doing some meditation even before you go into those rooms, into those interview sections. But try and be as outward focused as you can. If you can hold the door for somebody, great. If you can say hello to the janitor or to the front desk, or you can make conversation with some random person that might be in the same place as you interviewing, that's also good as well. I think what I've found to be really really interesting is that even as psychologists, I've been able to participate in some of the interview processes, and I've seen how a lot of times a lot of the psychologists in the committee are looking at everything. They're looking at your facial expressions, they're looking at your body mannerisms, they're looking at how you're interacting with non-faculty, right? So sometimes people try and put up a front with the faculty members, but they might be rude or disrespectful to somebody else. And if they see that, or if they know that, that could be a detriment to you. And one thing that was really stuck out to me is that I was talking to my supervisor about this, and they literally mentioned that when they were trying to figure out who to accept for a clinical psychology internship, they had the front desk make notes on people that would come up to them and ask them different questions. And after the whole internship process, they had a few top prospects, and they actually went to the front desk and they said, "Hey, we're done with the interview. What did you notice about the applicants? Was there anything that stuck out? We have a few strong people that we think did really, really well." And they brought up some of the names, and the front desk was like, "Ooh, I did not like this person. They were rude to me. They were short with me. They were kind of like just kind of disrespectful." And this was a prospect that had done really well in the actual internship process, and like actually, answering questions and different things like that. And so that deterred them from choosing that person because of the way they interacted with the non-faculty, right? So keep in mind that throughout this process, people are going to be watching you, and that's okay. That's totally okay. Try and be your genuine self as much as you can, but they're trying to look at every single thing that could be a mark on your application in terms of not choosing you. But if you show your genuine side, and you show who you are, and you are welcoming and generous, that's going to be obviously a huge positive mark as well. All right, so we have a question. Let's see. Hey, Phil, I'm a third year psychology major about to graduate. How did you find psychology jobs after graduating? Or how do you find psychology jobs after graduating? Yeah, really, really great question. I think it's great that you're already kind of thinking about this process even while you're an undergrad. For me personally, I finding psychology jobs can be really tricky, right? Because typically either you need some type of a license or certification, which is great. If you have the time, if you have the money, if you're wanting to get those certifications and the masters and work for a period of time and then go into a PhD program, wonderful. But if you're just wanting to get a psychology job right after graduate school, I would say the best thing that you can do is asking your professors. Your professors typically probably know a lot of people. They probably have a lot of networks that they can connect you to. I know a lot of people that got research assistant jobs right after their undergrad, and they were able to work with other professors. And research assisting didn't pay a ton, but it gave them experience and it gave them a job, right? So being able to network with your professors, I think, is really important. The other thing that I've recommended is using social media, using LinkedIn as a way to also put in applications to different places. I knew a lot of students that would pretty much message people on LinkedIn, people on social media about whether they had opportunities in terms of hiring. And they got those opportunities just by asking, right? So you are going to have to do a lot of work, right? Whether it's networking with your professors, whether it's going on social media and asking people, whether it's looking at what's going on in Indeed in terms of their job prospects. I think one thing that you can do too is that don't necessarily limit yourself to just a psychology job. You can broaden your horizon. You can look into neuropsychology. You can look into social work. You can look into sociology. You can look into history. You can look into teaching. Like anything that has to do with people and personal connection is something that you can put on your resume, and something that kind of typically counts as a psychology job. There's a lot of people who are in business positions, who are in tech, and they had psychology majors. Psychology is something that could be literally broadened to a whole lot of different professions, and it works to your advantage because it doesn't have to necessarily be specifically psychology. It can be business related, and you can still, like, for example, I had a student who got into a human resources position. It wasn't specifically psychology, but they were working with people, they were working with issues in the job, and they were able to tailor it in their personal statement as a psychology field because they were working with people. And there's actually a lot of people in human resources that do have psychology majors as well. So I would say, broaden your horizon, apply to a lot of different specialties and spaces, and give yourself that time to really get the experience that you want. All right. So hopefully that helps to answer your question. Got another question. It says, "Hi Phil, I want to get my master's in criminal psychology. Do you have any recommendations on careers I should pursue?" Wow. Okay, that's awesome. A master's in criminal psychology. So that's really cool. I think that kind of resonates a little bit, right, with forensic psychology. I think what I would do in this situation is, if you are an undergrad and you are a psychology major, a lot of times being an undergrad also gives you a lot of opportunities. If you're an undergrad right now, you should hopefully already be connected to your psychology club. Typically, every university has some form of a psychology club. And in that organization, you can get experience in different positions. You can be a secretary, you can be the president, whatever it is. But a lot of times they also have volunteering opportunities through that organization. And a lot of times what I've seen students do is that they will connect to their psychology organization, and they will bring in people to talk about different specialties. And so I've seen students bring in forensic psychologists, neuropsychologists to talk about their work, to talk about their specialty within that setting. If there's any way that you can either go through your school organization and learn about forensic psychology through your school organization, or you can look online and see if there are any forensic psychologists in your area and shadow them and ask them questions and build a relationship with them, I think that's also a huge thing to do as well. The best thing to do in terms of recommendations on careers is to shadow the career before you apply it to it. Really, shadow the person that you want to be 5, 10 years from now, so that you can have an understanding of how they did it and how you yourself can do it as well. And so I think that would just be my suggestion. I know there's a lot of masters in criminal psychology programs, and in terms of the what you can do for that type of specialty, you can do a lot, but also make sure that whatever program that you go into is what you want to go into. There might be some master's programs that only allow you to work in that criminal psychology type of field, but you can't do therapy with a patient, right? So make sure that whatever program you're going into, whether they emphasize research, whether they emphasize clinical experience or even whether they emphasize actual work in criminology and forensic psychology, that it's the same thing that you want to do after you go into that field. All right, so we have another question. All right, so for students who are more interested in clinical practice, would you tell them to not pursue a PhD or PsyD and to pursue a master's in social work or counseling? This is the $1 million question, right? I get this question all of the time, and it's such a good question. It just depends on so many different factors. I would say that if you are more interested in clinical practice, there's a lot of advantage to that because you can go into a master's program, which is less time, less money that you have to spend in terms of tuition, and you can start practicing as a mental health therapist, clinical social worker, clinical counselor right away. And you can make really good money doing that. You can go into a private practice, you can get other different specialties. If all you want to do is therapy, I think that is a great option to go into. One of the things about the PhD and the PsyD that people should really understand and should really weigh out the pros and cons is that with those programs, it does take longer, right? So you're looking at anywhere from 4 to 6 years. You're looking at more tuition, which could mean more debt to get out of. It's more competitive to get into. And a lot of times people think, oh, yeah, they make so much more money than a master's level therapist, but that may not always be the case. And so if you're really thinking about a PhD or a PsyD, I would hopefully reflect on what you want to do outside of clinical practice, outside of therapy with patients. A lot of times when people pursue that doctorate, it's also because they want to do research, they want to teach, they want to be like an assistant professor and an adjunct professor somewhere, or they want to do more psychological assessment. So they want to do neuro assessment, they want to do assessment for personality disorders or for ADHD or dementia or dyslexia. And the thing about assessment is that it's so integral to the field of psychology. It's really only psychologists that are doing full batteries, full neuropsych and clinical psychology assessments, and then writing like 10 to 12 pages of a report. There's no other field that does that. There's other fields that do assessment, right? Like neurologists will do an assessment, psychiatric nurse practitioners will do forms of assessment, but clinical psychology, we do essentially the most assessment and then we write the most in terms of our reports. So if writing is something that you're interested in, assessment is something that you're interested in, I think a PhD or a PsyD, or even if you're interested in teaching or research, I think a PhD or PsyD has really good options for that. But I also would say that if you're looking for a broad array of experiences and things that you want to do in the future, a clinical psychologist field or doctorate or degree is going to open up so many more doors for a diverse range of professional experiences than a clinical master's therapist, right? So there's definitely a lot of pros and cons to weigh. To answer your question in short, the clinical practice master's level therapist is a great option to go if you really just want to spend time on clinical practice. But if you are looking for diversity, if you're looking to do more things, if you're looking to really take your professionalism to the next level, then a PhD in PsyD is also a great option. And I've known a lot of people who will first become a licensed clinical social worker. They'll work for a period of time and then they'll go back to school later on, right? So they become a licensed clinical social worker, they pay off their debt, they're living life, they got their own private practice, and they're doing well. But then they realize that, you know what, I want to do more. So then they go into that PhD or this ID. So that's a good option too, because you may get that master's level therapist degree and you're good. That's all you want to do, right? And that's great. But if you get that degree and you realize 5, 10 years later that you want something else, then you're already going to have that basic foundation. And I would say that, schools really do choose a lot of licensed clinical social workers and licensed clinical mental health counselors because they already know that they have the foundation. And typically those students tend to do really well in a PhD or a PsyD program, right? So that's something to also consider as well. But It's a good question. I know I threw a lot out there, but hopefully that helped to answer your question. All right. So we're coming up just about on 45 minutes. I got some time for a few more questions. If there are any burning questions that you have, please feel free to put it in the comment section below. Even after the live stream, if people are watching this back, put your questions down in the comment section below. I'll be able to make sure to relook at that. If you have any questions for me, you can always reach out to me on Instagram or other social media platforms. All of that is in the link description below. So you can check me out there. If you feel like you need more one-on-one help and attention, feel free to email me or send me a message, or consider becoming a member. By becoming a member, I tend to spend a lot more time with people who are going through the application process. And so hopefully this session was really helpful. We talked about a lot of different things about choosing the right schools, about your personal statement, making sure that it's personalized to you, and then also about just in general your personal statement, your CV, your letter writers, and then interviewing at some of these schools. And yes, you're very welcome, Tamara. All right, looks like we have one more question. Here we go. Hey, Phil, what did you do before pursuing neuropsychology, and how did you know that you wanted to pursue the path? Awesome question. I think this is a great question to end on. So technically I am pursuing clinical psychology, which is just the general thing, but I am sort of doing neuropsychology on the side and health psychology on the side. But I'm actually a generalist, but I'm wanting to do neuropsychology and health psychology in the future. And so I know there's so many different types of specialties within clinical psychology, but neuropsychology is a part of what I want to do. And what I was doing before that was I actually was doing dental assisting. So I was doing dental assisting, and I actually was pursuing dentistry before pursuing clinical psychology. And so I reverted from dentistry into choosing clinical psychology because I really loved the whole body mind connection. At the time, I was from dental assisting. I worked as a medical exercise specialist, and I was working with physical therapists and occupational therapists. And I was pretty much creating workout programs for patients and helping them to work out in a safe and healthy way. And I realized that a lot of these patients not only had medical problems, but they also were having a lot of psychiatric and psychological issues. They were having anxiety and depression. And so I ended up shadowing a sports psychologist, shadowed a health psychologist, and I realized that this connection between the body and the mind is so pivotal. And so from working in the medical environment for such a long period of time, I wanted to engage in terms of that mental health, in terms of that psychological health. And so that's what made me pursue clinical psychology. And one of the things that I love about clinical psychology is that you can put both worlds together, both the medical and both the psychological. The medical informs your psychological perspective and how you do therapy and how you do clinical interventions. And by doing a lot of psychoeducation of patients about their medical problems, you can kind of marry the two worlds together. So it was an absolutely perfect fit for me in terms of what I was doing before, mainly medical, and now I get to do both, kind of be focused on the psychological, but I'm in a medical environment. And so I work with a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists and nurse practitioners. And so I'm still working in a medical environment, but I'm primarily doing psychological interventions, which is something that I love to do. And to answer your part two of your question, how did you know that you wanted to pursue this field? For me, I knew it when after I shadowed a sports psychologist, and after I saw some of the work that they were doing in helping athletes and also helping people with chronic health conditions and catering to the mind. I was sold. And what's really cool is that when you look at research studies that just focus on psychology, right, and are not focusing on medication or are not focusing on anything else, but just psychology, psychological interventions really do work, and they're really helpful. And so for me, that sold me in wanting to pursue that field. So hopefully that answers your question. All right. So everybody, that brings us to close to 50 minutes. This was awesome. This was awesome. I hope this was really helpful. We were able to talk about graduate school. I was able to answer a few of your questions. Like I mentioned before, if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me either through email or through social media. But with that, I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Typically, we're going to do these live streams every few months or so, just to kind of pretty much for me to answer any questions that you guys have in terms of burning questions. But hopefully this was helpful. Thank you all for those who participated and asked your question. I will see you all in the next video. Hope you guys have a great day.